the wrongs inflicted on colonial subjects by the British Empire. But I suggested at the end of my speech that India should be content with a symbolic reparation of £1 a year, payable for 200 years to atone for 200 years of imperial rule. I felt that atonement was the point. A simple sorry would do as well, rather than cash. Indeed, the attempt by one Indian commentator, Minhas Merchant, to compute what a fair sum of reparations would amount to, came up with a figure so astronomical, £3 trillion in today's money, that no one could ever reasonably be expected to pay it. The sum would be larger than Britain's entire GDP in 2015. This book is also not about British colonialism as a whole, but simply about India's experience of it. This is partly because discussing the entire history of British colonialism, as the speakers of the Oxford Union did, would have made for a huge and unwieldy book, but also simply because I don't know enough about it, whereas Indian history is a field I have delved into since my student days. I do not mean to discount the horrors of the British colonization of Africa, or the monstrosity of the slave trade, for which reparations may well be justified. It is striking that when slavery was abolished, the British government paid compensation not to the men and women so inhumanely pressed into bondage, but to their former owners for their loss of property. There are others who can do justice to those issues. I hope I have done justice in this volume to the specific case of British rule in India. There is a third respect in which this book differs from my speech. At Oxford I was arguing one side of a debate. There was little room for nuance or acknowledgement of counter-arguments. In a book laying out the evils of empire, however, I feel duty-bound to take into account the arguments for the British Raj as well. This I have done in each chapter, especially in Chapter 2, and in Chapters 3 to 7, in which I consider and reject most of the well-worn remaining arguments in favour of the British Empire in India. I have supplemented my own years of reading with extensive research both into colonial-era texts and into more recent scholarly work on the British in India, all duly cited in the notes at the end of the printed book. I hope my arguments have sufficient expert backing, therefore, to be regarded seriously even by those who may disagree with me. Finally, the book makes an argument. It does not tell a story. Readers looking for a chronological narrative account of the rise and fall of the British Empire in India will not find it here. The sequence of events is outlined only in the chronology preceding this preface. The purpose of this volume is to examine the legacy of the Raj, to critically study the claims made for its alleged benefits, and to present the evidence and the arguments against it. My speech did not, of course, arouse universal approbation. For one thing, in the context of the debate, I could scarcely acknowledge that many aspects of empire were far more complicated in nature or ambiguous in impact than any generalization of good or evil could do sufficient justice to. The book is built on the premise that many of the issues involved require more complex treatment and substantiation than is possible in a debating chamber. In addition, several other arguments were made in response to my speech that should be acknowledged here, even though they do not fit directly into the themes of any of my chapters. The most common of these criticisms is that India's post-colonial failings invalidate my attacks on Britain's colonial cruelties. Tharoor might have won the debate, but moral victory eludes India, wrote a columnist in Time magazine, arguing that the Indian government's performance since independence indicates that there is no evidence that any reparations paid to India would be spent well or would reach the intended beneficiary. One blogger added for good measure that the deplorable attitude of India's post-independence authorities is evident from over millions of tons of food grains that were found damaged in the government storage depots in 2010, as if incompetence after independence justified the famines that occurred before it. My position as a Member of Parliament for the Indian National Congress Party, which had ruled India for 52 of its 68 years of independence at the time I made my Oxford speech, left me vulnerable to another line of attack. Commentator Jonathan Foreman put it most bluntly. The Congress Party, he declaimed somewhat intemperately, misruled India for more than 6 decades, all the time becoming increasingly arrogant and corrupt, and seeming almost as insulated from ordinary Indians as their British predecessors had been, unquote. Indian leaders from the Congress were responsible, he said, for India's woeful Hindu rate of growth. and because of the ruling